going to change the subject a little bit, not completely change it. I'm going to go back to where we were in the beginning, because we were talking about being a leader and, different personalities of being a leader. And basically, you need a team in order to be a leader. And
Right.
teamwork is super important, but I think even more important for the culture that comes
Yeah.
out of being in a team starts with the leadership. And I've talked to you about, working for the Marine Corps and how, if we were if we were civilians coming in to train the Marines, we were never even going to get a chance to do it unless leadership bought in. So the importance
Right.
of leadership, talk to us about that.
Well, it's important. It's always important. I was going to say, is this the end of leadership? It depends on how you define leadership. My personal favorite definition is what a leader says happens. Now, there are many different interpretations. In fact, that's what I love about this, is it has a lot of different interpretations. But at the end of the day, a leader has to know that what he wants to have happen is going to happen. And many leaders struggle with that, either because they didn't hire good people, or they don't hold them accountable, or the outcome they want is really not very reasonable or not doable or feasible. But that's it. And obviously, a leader needs to have some sort of an organization or followers, otherwise you can't be called a leader. But a leader has to be so good that what he wants to have happen happens. And that gets challenged when suddenly you can't see the people, and you can't use your usual way of motivating, even if it is yelling. Certainly Steve Jobs was a yeller. And I find it hard to believe that somebody who yells would do it here. For one thing, they can see themselves as they're doing it, and they may not be happy. But it's probably, as a management technique, well, first of all, very limited, but you do a lot of damage if you're not there, as we just talked about. If you're used to having a group and you can sort of fix things that you rat when you take people to task. But it really does make it imperative that you have the right team. Obviously, productivity is going up. If productivity is not going up, that is already a sign. So it just accentuates the things you need. You need to have core values that are understood by everybody, so that behavior patterns are already sort of ingrained. You need a strategy. You need to have done the strategic planning piece, because that is also a team building play. Something that builds teams. You can do virtual retreats, virtual cocktail parties, something that sort of emulates somewhat face-to-face, but lets people relax and be with one another. So there are a lot of tools, but I think, the problem with leadership is that we all think it's about the outcome, and in many cases it is. But in many cases, that's not how the leader is being judged. One, because not everybody knows what the outcomes are that the leader is looking for, and he may have outcomes, or she may have outcomes determined by their board, that a lot of people would question, that there are good reasons to want that outcome. What we see is literally what we see and hear. And the media is a perfect example. The way they judge presidents, it's all based on behavior and the communication. And that's really so important with leaders, is there are disempowering and empowering behaviors. Tolerance, for example, is a disempowering behavior, counterintuitively, because that's when you start letting people get away with things. You don't hold them accountable. So that would be an example of a disempowering one. Another one is being rigid, being authoritarian. It's where you're robbing power. So again, it just accentuates what it means, what's necessary to be accepted as a leader and to achieve that what a leader says happens. So you got to check your behaviors. And that also has to do with your mindset. Your mindset, it becomes much more important, because it's got to be pretty clear on being the sort of mindset that will get things done. And then obviously communication is key. And if you can't communicate it well and you can't get them to understand, and there are all sorts of little tricks that you do to do that, let's call them techniques. But you've got to be able to communicate. And of course, another counterintuitive part is, even in the most creative industries, the best communication is the repetitive communication.
So consistency, that's what I was going to say, is the consistency that builds
and
trust.
Literally the words,
Yeah.
we have 3 months to get this done. We have 3 months to get this done. That becomes something you say over and over again, because the more you hear it, the more you remember it.
Right.
So
And time starts ticking at that as soon as they say that, because then sooner or later it's going to be 2 months, and you don't start then. You should already be a month into it at that point, you know?
Exactly. So these are all best practices which just become more important when you're working virtually.
So I took an interesting, or I think it was a TED talk I was listening to, and it was one of those exercises, like you said, or tricks, or it's not a trick, but it's necessary.
Technique, it's something you implement that's necessary, and for some people it may be hard to learn, and others easy.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what it was called, but it was the different colors. Like every person kind of, sometimes you're a blend of them, but like red is like that fiery personality, certain type, green is something else, and blue. And I thought that was very interesting. And the point of the TED Talk was you have to know yourself. And then you also have to know that the best part of that red, where it's like a go-getter and it's this type of a personality, the flip side of that doesn't think you're so great. Because you got to work with people who are very different than you, and then there's the perception piece.
Right, but that's where core values are so key. So you can have someone who likes red, and you have someone who likes blue, and another one who likes gray, but they've signed on to a certain kind of core values, and that's usually because they have those core, or they themselves have adopted similar core values, and that's why that's so important. And in fact, most people get a job. Obviously, you have to have a certain experience. That's part of just getting in the door. It's because they fit with the culture. When I was recruiting a lot, you just tell when somebody walked in the door, how they were dressed, just like what you said, how they stand, how they present themselves. You could tell whether or not they fit in with the culture of the organization I was leading at the time. And that's really where that comes in, culture and core values. If those aren't in place, you're going to have it harder to be a leader virtually, because you do have to set an example. And right now, the only example I'm setting is having the lighting right and looking at the screen. There's not too much else.
I still have not got the lighting.
Yeah. Whereas if you see me in person, there are certain things that immediately get communicated about what's correct, what my expectations are.
Yeah, so you definitely go a lot by body language. Like you study that. That's something that you've always been interested in, or is just something that you've picked up over the years of working in the businesses and with the type of people that you work with?
I've always been interested in it, but what I've also learned is you can make mistakes, especially culturally. I lived in Japan working for the CEO of Sony, and there, I think actively they try to confound us through certain body language things. In other words, they know how we read it, so they purposely act a certain way to get a response out of you, usually to make you more pliable and open to working with them. But that's a culture where a lot of the body language stuff that we use in the West just doesn't happen. Facial expressions are very minimal, for example. They don't shake hands, they bow. Shaking hands has traditionally always been a way to test somebody, if it's a firm handshake or a fishy one.
Look where that got us now, though. That's going away.
Excuse me?
I said, look where that's going, where that's gotten us now. The handshaking, they had the shoes outside. Yeah, the shoes outside and the bowing. I think they're onto something with that.
Exactly. So you have to be very careful. I still think face is the easiest thing to really judge what's going on, and then the energy. If you get good at feeling the energy, and any good presenter or leader, somebody who has to be in front of a group, is you got to read the group real fast. And you also got to be able to know if you're connecting. And again, there are techniques that you look at each individual in the eyes at some point early on in whatever speech you're giving. So all that is a little bit harder virtually.
Yeah. But you know what? They're probably going to come up with holograms. Sooner or later, we'll be able to zoom ourselves right. I mean, I honestly think virtual reality or holograms or something along those lines to kind of put maybe that more of that personal touch back into it, or that feeling like you're in the same room.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, we are social beings. So, at some point we do really want to, I mean, most of us, certainly those of us who are extroverted, need people around them with energy and so forth. Introverts in a virtual world have it better because they're used to being by themselves. Their ideas get generated within themselves. They don't necessarily need the group. Um, so everybody has different preferences. I like it because traveling by subway in New York to go into coaching sessions like every day, go into the city, into Manhattan, it's just a little draining. And I use the time to email, but we have a lot of dead zones. So my phone doesn't always work. I'm glad that, and you talk about productivity, that's one of the reasons is I don't lose so much time. I can get more done because I'm not walking to the subway, sitting there, getting out of the subway, walking to the office and doing the same thing coming home. So in some ways, if my clients, I think, like the virtual meetings a little bit more, I would definitely do more of these. It makes me more productive.
Yeah, I think like my husband works, he's a Marine. So,
Mm.
they've always done things this way. That's always a very hard thing because talk about
Right.
culture and talk about consistency. They wrote the book on that.
Yeah.
So getting them to kind of change how they do things isn't always the easiest. And yet I think
Mhm.
that they've come around to, yeah, we can't wait to get back to the way we used to do things, but
Mhm.
there's going to be more and more times now where we're not going to do them the way we used to. Like they are going to utilize more of the virtual. My husband would have to get on a plane to go to a meeting for one
Oh,
day. And
yeah.
but in this day and age, this is before COVID, we had this capability. Why wouldn't you do that? It's got to cost a fortune
I,
to fly everybody in for that meeting.
yeah, yeah. It's the classic change management program
Yeah.
is how do you get people to convince to do something? And a lot of times it's laziness. There's a lot of fear often, basic fear like I'm really bad with technology and now they're going to ask me to do this and I'm going to look like a fool. So better just to avoid it. Um, yeah, I mean,
Security. There's also the security issue when you're talking about certain
and
groups.
coming back to a comment you said a couple minutes ago, there's a phrase that I like very much, which is all new things seem superficial at first.
Hmm.
But and if you think about it, you think, well, this is why I always did face to face because I thought, anybody can get on a cam and talk to somebody else. Are they going to get the real value? It seems
Right.
awfully superficial. Um, but as it gains more acceptance and we learn how to do it well, it'll become the norm. I
Yeah.
mean, I remember when email came out and we weren't faxing. My first thought is we got to be careful how we put our emails because you can push the send button too early. But yeah, it seemed wispy, sort of not tangible for a
Right.
while.
Yeah. No, I agree 100%. I mean, I remember the first time I even got on the internet, I was like, what do you do? You know, you didn't really even know where to go or how to do it. I was like,
Yeah,
okay, so we can get mail. That was
yeah.
pretty much all I knew to do for a really long time.
Right, right. No, and that is a big part of disruption is when new technologies facilitate a different way of working, living, whatever, we get literally disrupted because we have to stop what we've been doing and learn how to use a different system or a different technology that ultimately will be better. But there's a lot of anguish, maybe a little bit hard, but there's a lot of inherent thresholds you have to go through for people to adopt a new way of doing things.
Yeah. And I look at the schools. My sons are both in high school, so we didn't have a hard time when we had a switch and they stopped school and now they were going to their laptops. The teachers had a hard time implementing it, and I totally get that because they
Mhm.
really were the leaders at that point. They had to figure out how are they going to get across the curriculum in a way that every child had an opportunity to the computers even. I mean, it was a very big undertaking. But for my kids to sit down and figure out how to do online schooling, that wasn't so hard. But my friends who had kids who were younger, that's a lot harder. I mean, that
Yeah.
that was definitely something that I think a lot of kids really struggled a lot with. And so again,
Well,
disruption affects different people in different ways.
right. And these children are going to grow up to be adults, and their world of technology, something I learned at Sony, is every generation has its media. Our generation was more the TV generation.
Right.
Our children are the internet generation. Our parents were movies.
And
Our
radio.
grandparents, yeah, and our grandparents was radio.
Yeah.
So these, again, 20 years from now, when they're starting out to work and they start building companies, everything's probably going to look different. I don't
Yeah.
know how, but we're going to also sit there as grandparents and go, oh, why
I
would
know.
anybody for that?
I still won't like their music. And I remember my parents always being like, "What is that music you're listening to?" But I listen to my kids' music now, and I'm kind of the same way. I'm like, and now my kids are listening to like old school rock. They're listening to
Yeah,
like
yeah.
Bruce Springsteen and Van Halen and this. And I'm like, see, I told you ours was the best.
Exactly.